It's no secret that railways allowed for industrialization. However, like in all countries, geography sometimes becomes a boundary to that progress. One such example would be the Appalachian Mountains, cutting through the eastern United States. Starting in Georgia and Alabama, they culminate in Newfoundland and were originally the dividing line between European colonizers and the expansive continent. And yet, in at least one instance, they were conquered thanks to a mighty feat of engineering. In its time, the Blue Ridge Tunnel seemingly defied the limits of technology. Yet today, the entirety of its 1,300-meter length is totally abandoned, if not forgotten. So, how was it built? Why was it left behind? And more importantly, what does its legacy mean today? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the rise and fall of the Blue Ridge Tunnel. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. The invention of passenger trains and the construction of tunnels like Blue Ridge have completely transformed travel safety. Before their arrival, journeys involved dangerous crossings on winding and sometimes precarious roads, with risks of accidents and even robberies. And to be perfectly honest with you, these risks have taken on a new form: the internet. I'm serious. Although technology has advanced significantly, leaving personal information on some sites is still risky. You risk it falling into the hands of individuals or entities like data brokers. They gather individuals' data and sell it for profit. This process involves collecting information from multiple sources, which is then meticulously integrated to form a complete and detailed profile of each person, putting them at risk of identity theft or phishing scams. But thanks to our sponsor, Delete Me, you can now stop worrying about these troubles. Delete Me is a fantastic service that will erase your personal data from PeopleSearch websites. Vital information like addresses, old photos, and phone numbers can all be eliminated. Additionally, thanks to their automated monitoring system, Delete Me ensures that records won't repopulate after being deleted. It's simply fantastic. Since starting my own online journey, I've witnessed numerous cases of colleagues affected by a lack of privacy. From identity theft on social media to being attacked for past public opinions, not to mention cases of phishing scams that have caused them significant financial loss. The risks are real, so it's crucial that we all take action to protect ourselves. So get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Socash and use promo code SOCASH at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Socash, promo code SOCASH. Let's start off by explaining the mountain range in question, in particular, Rockfish Gap, a major navigational challenge. The gap is almost 2,000 feet high and separates Manassas from the James River. And at its highest point, the Afton Mountain that comprises most of Blue Ridge is 2,418 feet high. Local writer Phil James poetically describes it as, quote, buffed by ceaseless westerly winds, lifting streams of migrating birds and flying insects, and night skies so clear that the secrets of the heavens were nearly revealed. And with seasonal fog and snow that hid the sun and turned nights into ceaseless caves. The earliest European travelers successfully crossed the gap in 1730 and began forming county roads for their expansion into the mountains. Later, the mountains housed taverns, providing shelter for a wide range of travelers, from peasants to then-Governor Thomas Jefferson, as he and the state legislature of Virginia fled from the Royal Army. Many years later, he would return with his friends and colleagues of the new American government to settle in a tavern, where many important decisions were made in early America. Led by Jefferson in 1818, the Rockfish Gap Commission had meetings in the Mountaintop Inn to discuss the area's future, such as the location of the University of Virginia. While this area was far from the more hostile parts of the Appalachians, even just within Virginia, it posed a challenge for expanding geographically and economically. Change was needed, and fortunately, the age of steam and steel was coming across Europe and North America. A new railroad was obviously the choice for connecting the two regions across the gap. Still, the primitive power of steam engines at this point couldn't be expected to climb the hills, nor could this early period of American industrialism build a bridge strong enough to cross it. To the Virginia state government, the answer was obvious but unfortunately very difficult. They needed to tunnel through the mountains. The Virginia General Assembly chartered the Blue Ridge Railroad Company on March 5, 1845. The company wasn't meant to operate permanently into the future, but instead shouldered the cost of connecting the existing Louisa Railroad Company through the new tunnel. They were tasked to build 4 tunnels through the mountain range, an unprecedented task both by scale and cost. Virginia's leader in this endeavor was an unlikely but engineering individual named Claudius Crozet. Claudius was a former French artillery officer who immigrated to America after the final fall of the Napoleonic Empire. His most vital partner was John Kelly, an Irish immigrant who moved his business from Maryland to the Appalachians with a group of his most trusted and strongest workers. When they surveyed the land for their mission, they knew their work would be long and hard. The west side of the ridge was less steep and more manageable, so it was easy to connect to the planned bridge to Waysboro before continuing over somewhat flatter land. The east side, however, was the most rugged terrain Claudius had ever seen, marked by steep gradients and hollows over 1,000 feet wide. The work would be no easy task, not even as the army of primarily Irish immigrant laborers set up their shanty town around what would become the entrances to the tunnel. In this era, most tunnels were started by digging vertically from the mountain's peak and then expanding the tunnel horizontally as needed. Thanks to this tunnel being 700 feet below the peak, that wouldn't work. The laborers needed to carve the tunnel instead horizontally and meet in the middle. With the drilling and blasting started in late winter, water from natural streams and melting snow was everywhere, constantly making an already dimly lit worksite wet and slippery, punctuated by jagged, uneven rocks on the walls and floor. It was dangerous work, and there's a reason that most people taking the job were either fleeing the Irish potato famine or were already enslaved Africans sold to the company. No one who wasn't desperate would take on this kind of job, a fact that I felt we needed to acknowledge. Another disadvantage for the workers was the dynamite, or should I say lack thereof, as dynamite had yet to be invented, and hence all the men had were pickaxes and unpredictable black powder. 2 teams initially slowly drilled the gunpowder into the side of the mountain, always working carefully around the unpredictable explosive. Virginia plantation owners such as Thomas Jefferson Randolph and Mordecai Sizer would often take work from the company to grind down stone culverts to channel water away from the eventual tracks. Then they'd set the base of the tracks by breaking up gravel and arranging the wooden rail ties. However, in an ironic twist of fortunes, since the average price of a male slave in 1850 was $1,200, it's generally believed and recorded that plantation owners kept them from the more dangerous work on site, such as clearing paths through the trees and helping to build bridges over the valley. The paid workers were perhaps aware of this, or at least aware of their poor conditions. Given their conditions and growing level of communication problems between railroad workers and the county, they hatched one of the first large-scale railway worker walkouts ever. Men working for the B&O Company in Maryland walked out in early March and were followed by the Blue Ridge Company by the 26th of that same month. The men demanded higher wages, and the protest dragged on into April. Their demands were refused, leading some men to walk away from the mountain entirely. Others continued to die of violence in the villages, explosions in the tunnel, and sickness across the shantytown. According to Arthur Mary E. Linus, for every mile of progress along the Blue Ridge Railroad in 1850, an Irish person died. Their burial places are unknown. Given the nature of the shantytown workers lived in, they were probably buried near the camps but have had their graves covered up by a century and a half of forest growth. While work on the east side was at least gradually successful, the harder greenstone on the west forced the crews to accept a much slower progress. Unlike the west side, the drills couldn't deal with the materials they were facing and would dull out much faster. In face of the stagnant progress, tools that just weren't up to the task, underpay, and the fact that other companies were having far more success across Appalachia, the workers struck again, this time successfully raising their pay at least slightly to a height of $1.25 a day. That would eventually increase to $1.50 for the demolition layers. Constant dread hung over the shanty towns as they descended deeper and deeper into the mountain range. By 1854, threats of avalanches and cave-ins from the explosives were constant. However, initial fears that the project would take 8 years of work were miscalculated, as the two teams, sent from east and west, finally met in the middle on Christmas Day in 1856. Claudius Croiset, excited to have finally fulfilled his mission, yet burnt out at the same time, stated to the Virginia government, quote, "I will continue to give my attention to the winding up of this business if you desire it. I would greatly prefer that my connection with the work should end within the year." When the final work was finished, laying brick arches to protect passing trains, he resigned from the company, leaving with most of his workers for the Blue Ridge Railroad Company to be absorbed into what would become Virginia Central. Claudius understood the magnitude of his mission. When the first trains finally crossed through the tunnel in 1858, the Blue Ridge Tunnel became the longest railroad tunnel on Earth, and hardly one that was built under ideal conditions. Claudius was undoubtedly the man to see his mission through, even if it wasn't appreciated then. After he died in 1864, to honor his accomplishment, in 1870, the small town of Wayland's Crossing in Virginia was renamed Croiset. Meanwhile, the Blue Ridge Tunnel continued operating throughout the 19th century and even survived into the mid-20th century. Still, as trains got bigger due to the invention of diesel locomotives, the tunnel was retired in 1944 after newer, wider ones were drilled along the same route. The tunnel remained abandoned, closed, and off-limits for decades, while those shanty towns built up by former workers were covered up by decades of forestry. And for decades, the tunnel disappeared from public memory, only to recently reemerge. Many of you are well aware of the Appalachian Trail, a long stretch of connected hiking paths from the American South to New England. The national project, started by the FDR administration, is one of the country's most famous hiking and mountaineering paths. It's expanded over time, like tributaries leading into the smaller paths across the East Coast. While the tunnel itself is not a part of the trail, by the 2010s, people realized that it had potential as a tourist destination. In fact, if we want to be precise, this all started in 2001, when officials in Nelson County introduced and quickly acted on plans to reopen the tunnel to the public. In 2007, they successfully purchased the unused tunnel from CSX and began planning easements and pathways, which they started working on after buying part of the surrounding land in 2013. Sadly, at this point, opening the tunnel itself would not have been possible based on the original engineering estimate, which blew the town's budget, and this should not have been a surprise. Thankfully, the county repeatedly succeeded in taking grants from the state and federal government to push the restoration through in stages. When it finally opened in 2020, it was a rousing success for the county. In under 7 months, 60,000 visitors came through the tunnel, and it's only gotten more attention since then. Hundreds of different hiking blogs have shared pictures and videos of the old tunnel, while hundreds of thousands have traveled through it once again. From all the videos and pictures I've seen just researching this, it seems to be a unique and spectacular experience. The Blue Ridge Tunnel is an eye-opening throwback to early American history, as well as the complex struggles that defined the nation while it was still young. Yes, in the heart of Virginia, we built a 2-mile-long tunnel hundreds of feet below the earth, and it was the largest of its type at that point. But we owe that accomplishment to the entire legion of men and boys displaced from their homes in Ireland, led by a French artillery officer fleeing the fallout of Napoleon's failed conquest of Europe. It's a unique accomplishment that requires dozens of factors to succeed and still almost failed. Now that it's been reopened, we can go there as a people and country and take a minute to reflect and understand that our American brothers made this. So if you enjoy a quiet hike and a touch of history, the Blue Ridge Tunnel might very much be your cup of tea. But as you may have realized by now, I'm in the heart of Europe, about 4,500 miles away from Virginia. And so I guess I'll have to have my tea here. Otherwise, I thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.